years and find yourself now on the Gold Coast. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the history of the Straits? Oh, you'll need to unmute yourself there, Bill, just your microphone. Sorry, there we go.
Got me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to acknowledge our traditional custodian of this land that we are broadcasting live. And I was born Thursday Island. Island home is Erub Darnley Island. I've also have a link to Murray Island. I'm from the Dawara Reb tribe at Murray Island and a Meram tribe at Erub Darnley Island. And I'm now reside on the Gold Coast for 30 years now, and I have played a big role in the community establishment on the Gold Coast. I am now today as a chairperson for Calwyn Development Corporation. My aim is to better our health, livelihood of our community on the Gold Coast.
Thanks, Bill. And certainly we'll look forward to looking at the Torres Strait perspectives around historical acceptance. And bearing in mind, here in Queensland, we are in fact the home of both the Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islander First Peoples. And that is a unique sort of situation we find ourselves in, particularly as we move forward in talking about reconciliation and matters like treaty and other matters as well. But look, I'd like to introduce our final member of the panel today, an interesting person who's now working with, and the reason I say interesting is David has had an interesting journey as a non-Indigenous person with the Uluru Statement, and finds himself now working with the Queensland Resources Council. David, do you want to share a little bit about that journey with us?
Of course. Thank you very much, Uncle Bill, and I'd like to join in the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. I've supported reconciliation, as you've said, through a variety of roles, as a policy advisor for government, through supporting non-profits, and as a corporate lawyer, but first and foremost as an advocate for the Uluru Statement from the heart. Over that journey, which I'm happy to talk about later, the principal thing that I've learned is that it's important to listen and support. And that's, I think, how we'll eventually get to a more reconciled Australia. And I look forward to speaking about that further later.
Well, Dave, thanks. Great advice. And look, what we might do before we get into our panel discussion, just for the benefit of those who are joining us today, is to, I suppose, get our heads around some of the issues that sit behind truth and who are the first peoples of Australia. So we might now just watch a couple of videos and to sort of give us that understanding of what our conversation, the context of what we're going to speak about today.
In every nation's story, there are important moments, events, and crossroads that shape the chapters to come. It is these moments that a nation has a chance to ask itself who we are and who we want to be. For all Australians, this ancient land connects the stories of our past, our present, and our future. But the story we tell today has many gaps, chapters not connected, with parts of our history left off the records, silenced in classrooms, missing in papers. This untold, untaught story leaves parts of our nation holding the burden of trauma, while others live with a historical blind spot. Shielded from not only stories too hard to tell, but stories that need to be celebrated, of courage, innovation, and triumph. If we believe in fairness and justice for everyone, if we know that our diversity makes us richer, if we know we are stronger together, what lays ahead of us is a journey of truth. In writing this next chapter together, the common ground we have is that we are all here, woven into this country in this moment in time. So let's make history we can all be proud of. Reconciliation in Australia. Our history, our story, our future.
It's time to share some truths about the first Australians, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They're called First Australians for a reason. They've lived on this land for thousands of years, and that's why their connection to country is so important. When the English arrived over 200 years ago, much of everything they knew changed forever, with the impact and trauma of colonisation still felt even today. Equal rights have also been an ongoing struggle. As recently as 1967, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples weren't even considered people. In the eyes of Australian government law, they were only equal to flora and fauna. From then on, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been officially recognised and managed to gain some basic rights like voting, education, health and employment. But in many ways, the damage is still deep and lasting. Today, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on average suffer from significantly higher rates of disease, violence, incarceration and suicide, while having fewer opportunities in education and employment. But the most distressing truth is that an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child born today can expect to live 11 years less than a non-Indigenous child. Through all these distressing facts, some things are looking up. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are rising to the challenge, bringing together people from all across Australia who are making a difference in health, education and employment, aiming to close that gap within 25 years.
I'm live for the next half an hour. Hello, and welcome back. We're actually, it's interesting to note that as we're going through this process of looking at historical acceptance, that here is a dimension of reconciliation today. It would be useful, I suppose, to do this in a sort of a bit of a time, a bit of a timeline as to what sorts of issues were happening, at various points in our nation's history, because there are many things in there. And if you think of reconciliation by virtue of that word means at some point we're going to reconcile and we're going to draw a line in the sand. And an important element of reconciliation is in fact acknowledging truth. And there are matters which need to be reconciled. So the purpose of today's conversation, just opening up this dimension here in Queensland, is to look at some of those truths. And I suppose a good place to start is BC, before Cook, before Captain Cook arrived in Australia. And, to look at, I suppose, some of the key elements of the last 60,000 years, which signify, Aboriginal people as having, and Torres Strait Islander people as having a long connection to country and a long connection to this region. In saying that, Cheryl, I know you've written quite a number of books about contemporary, issues around land rights and so forth. But if we had to say one of the things about, looking at, our history before Cook, and one of the things that we need as a country to acknowledge, what would be one of those key elements that we would need around, particularly culture and language?
I think one of the key elements when you're looking at historical acceptance, this whole topic on today, is that there's an assumption that we come from a level playing field. That's not what exists, because what has happened is that we now have scientific evidence that proves that we have been on this land and connected to this land and this environment for 165,000 years. And having said that, there also needs to be a whole conversation, not about acceptance, but real acknowledgement of the fact that, firstly, we were a civilised people. We had a very amazing structure and a society that we had law, L-A-W, it had L-O-R-E, we had culture, we had language, we had astronomy, we had science, we had physics. We had everything that people generally accept is what you have within a society or a civilised society. That today still is in question. And I say that because even recently, a week ago, 2 of my grandchildren were racially profiled because they're Aboriginal kids, 15-year-old twins. And so I think we have a long way to go. And I think I resent the fact that if we talk about our people as before Cook, that we're in some kind of romantic, you know, ideal of everything was great, everything was fine. But when I look at it, and the way that I teach it is this: we couldn't have existed for 165,000 years had we not had an absolute respect and understanding of everything, every aspect of the world that we lived in and the world around us and the world that we wanted to create into the future for our future 7 generations, which is in our law what we're responsible for. So I thought I'd just throw that out there to kind of begin the discussion, and we'll just see how it goes from there.
Oh, sorry about that. One of the key elements that we need to look at as we move forward is going to be that issue that we have been here for millennia, and importantly that not only have we been here for millennia, but we are now in a position where, I suppose, with people who've come to Australia, is the recognition of, you know, what that actually means in terms of not only us and our future, but their future as well. But in saying that, the Torres Straits, Bill, has been an interesting has an interesting history in, you know, so far as before Cook, as it were, or before the coming of the Europeans to Australia. The Torres Straits certainly, as we know, had a long enduring history in that region. But certainly since then, and in the last 200 years, there has been a lot of conflict in the Straits as well. Do you want to share a bit of that with us, please, Bill? You might have to unmute your mic there, Bill. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly, Uncle Bill. Over years, we used to have conflict with the neighbouring islands, with the authorities and the values that we've been searching, our hunting skills. Because of the Torres Strait being 20% of land mass, the ownership of the land was shared by each other, and to operate in such a sense where we came as the whole of community trusted each other and we support each other in every aspect of growing up. There hasn't been any hatred within the community until colonialism have introduced to the Torres Strait. Now there are laws that stated that once a crime is committed, he is then forcefully removed from the island, and over generation, some of the people that are left have never returned. Now that's gone through a generation for a period of 3 generations, and the family now reside on the mainland. I am thinking that with the opportunity still here, and there is a barrier difference of the removal of families, and I think we need to learn about the things that we do on the island. We need to trust each other, and we need to discuss the law and bring our community back. Now, over time, I have witnessed this, my personal experience. Now that I'm fortunate enough to understand and trying to heal that process, I'd like everyone in the Torres Strait that are on the mainland to reconcile with the community back home and find their pathway to return back home. Now, it's not only from the laws being broken on the island. There are other things. We had the pearling industries. We've had a lot of ventures into the Torres Strait that are now, we need to reconcile and prevent opportunities for our people back home. Those things really need to be discussed and reconciled, with stolen wages, for instance, the land treaty issues. Those sort of things I really think that need to be brought forward. Truth needs to be heard. Truth needs to be heard. And to be able to do that is to reconcile one with the new act of the legislation as such, and the people that are on the mainland to return back home. Let's strengthen the bond and look forward to educate future generation.
And Bill, I think one of the things with not only the Torres Strait people, but certainly I know with the Aboriginal people, is this strong inherent desire to get back and look after country, and importantly to resume their role of custodians, which is for us, we're very much people about the creator, and and if I think about even for me as an Aboriginal person now, my life story is still that connection to country and that connection to the creator, and how important responsibility that is. So, and and as we become empowered in this process, I suppose there is a saying, with great power comes greater responsibility. And as we become more empowered, I think our generation in this process through reconciliation, we need to be responsible for looking after country and looking after those customs and ways and language. And that's, I think, a real challenge for us, particularly at the moment in this point in history with us here in Australia. And I might just ask then, it's probably a good segue, I suppose, Charmaine, into looking at just here in Australia. And I know you've had a lot of experience in the reconciliation journey with the original Council for Reconciliation. You had ample opportunities to meet around the country in those times. And I know both you and Cheryl recently also had the opportunity to go around Queensland and look at treaty matters, and historical acceptance and truth-telling was a big feature of that. Do you want to share some of that story with us as well today?
I think when we're talking about reconciliation, we need to, and it's very apt at the moment with what's happening in the States and elsewhere, reconciliation, the process came out of, the catalyst was the death of a young man in Brisbane, and I won't mention the name because of family, but that process spurred on the Aboriginal Deaths in Custody report, and from there was a report on, there was a recommendation that the country needed to go through a process of reconciliation. And part of that, of course, during the process of the 10-year the council was there was a lot of truth-telling. There was a lot of people who had never engaged before with Aboriginal people. In the early days, we'd ask who's spoken to an Aboriginal person, something pretty basic. And no one would put their hand up. By the end of the 10 years, people were talking to each other. It was a very unique process because all aspects of society, we had QCOS, we had the mining industry, the pastoralists, we had Aboriginal leaders. It was a process that was criticised by many, but it was a successful process in that it did educate and it did make people think about some of the historical things that hadn't happened. And I think some of the changes to curriculum, even though they're not enough, have been as a result of that. But in more recent times, for me, it's been very interesting to revisit that process because during the PAFTA treaty consultations, Cheryl and I visited about 16 communities, and the communities we visited were many of the communities I'd consulted with 20 years ago. And the sad thing was, the first thing that comes up in every meeting would be, we need our stories told. We can't heal until the stories are told. Truth-telling has to happen. Truth-telling has to happen on both sides. So really the discussions of the early 90s and the discussions now haven't moved that far. But on the other hand, there's been a shift, particularly with young people, I found, in the pride of Aboriginal young people. 20 years ago, if you asked someone who's your mob, many times people wouldn't say. Now people proudly, start speaking by saying, this is who I am, this is my family, this is what, and that was a source of huge pride, to see how proud these young Aboriginal people were of their culture and their family. And I think that change has, I'm hoping that change will inspire in the white fellas like like my mob, that change is good and history is important, and these people have this amazing culture and history and family, and look how proud they are of it.
Well, thanks, Charmaine. I think some real. It's important, the history and the journey we've been on since the legislation came in 1992, and certainly from the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Islander Deaths in Custody. It certainly outlined that there are a lot of things historically and in a contemporary sense that we need to be dealing with. One of the things I do note there, though, is that with that Royal Commission to Aboriginal Islander Deaths in Custody report, and even today, there are many of those recommendations still haven't been fully actioned. And
I think this is about the only one that was fully actioned.
Right. Well, reconciliation was, I think, 363, was it 367 or one of those?
354.
337, is that right? Yeah, or 339. I'm not too sure. Sorry, pardon me. But the recommendation for reconciliation was one of those, as you say, which was actioned. Several others were. Many of those recommendations were carried forward also in the report. And I don't know, but the report of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, I suppose, set into place the history of where we are today in terms of the reconciliation movement. And I know one of those key things were setting up organisations like Reconciliation Queensland, Reconciliation Australia as part of a network of reconciliation peak bodies around the country to advance the cause, to really, I suppose, put into place processes for reconciliation to move forward. In saying that, though, reconciliation has been for us, I think, as a nation, a bit like pulling teeth, a very painful experience. It's a necessary one. We know we have to deal with it, but there's a lot of pain associated with it. And for example, some people really get to the point where they just do not really want to confront that. And historical acceptance and truth-telling can be a very confronting process as you go through it. And I know that for Aboriginal people, that our truths, there are many truths in this whole process, but there are a lot of truths also for non-Indigenous people. And David, I know in your journey, having to come to terms with some of those truths has been, also a very traumatic experience for you and your people as well. Dave. Yep. There we go.
Hi, Uncle Bill. Well, I suppose in my experience, the best thing that non-Indigenous people can do to support reconciliation is, as I said before, to listen, first and foremost, to listen and to support. And the thing that always humbles me is listening to stories of the strength of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. As Cheryl and Bill have both said in their own ways, these are incredibly durable peoples with deep LORE and strong LAWS that sustain them over millennia. That's something which a lot of non-Indigenous people simply don't understand. So with that in mind, the action related to this pillar of reconciliation is to acknowledge our past through education and understanding. And so the question for me is, how do we get non-Indigenous people to come on that journey? The Uluru Statement says, when we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds and their culture will be a gift to their country. So I'll end by saying that non-Indigenous people should listen and support Indigenous people, to trust in the strength that exists in those peoples, and to recognise the gift that that culture would be to us all. From my point of view, that would be an absolute gift to Australia as a whole. So the Uluru Statement asks for a truth-telling process connected to a treaty process, and I hope that we embark on that process sooner rather than later for the good of everyone.
Yeah, look, thanks, Dave. And I think in looking at that whole process that we've mentioned through the Uluru Statement, it's important to note that there's also, I think, in there some other truths which are highlighted there. The fact that the Uluru Statement did take place for many First Nations people and in the way that it took place was a little bit challenging, I need to say at the outset. And I think that's another truth. There are many truths in this. It's a bit like, you know, when we look at the Uluru Statement, it didn't involve consultation widely with the whole of the 300 plus nations or First Nations peoples in Australia. But it took selectively, I suppose, various leaders and individuals from communities to bring them together to try and, I suppose, get a feeling of or to at some point, at a point in time, to encapsulate what were some of the truths that they wanted, you know, they saw on behalf of all of our people as being to move forward on. And I do know that, you know, one of those key things that we all adhere to is the need for our own voice to be heard in decision making about us and about our country, about Australia, and about our role as not only First Peoples in this country, but as Australian and as Australian citizens. So that voice and the recognition of our people in there is so important as well. And so I suppose in saying that, as we move forward, there are a number of elements there, and certainly the Uluru Statement, I think, puts that challenge to the Australian people now to listen, as you say, as a beginning. And truth-telling is also, I suppose, about acknowledging that there are points in our past that we can learn from. And, you know, and that's really one of the key elements, I suppose, that Shane up in Cooktown, the local Bummer people, have been working closely with the Cook Shire, particularly in this year, the 250th year since Captain Cook actually arrived on these shores. And I know that for many in the country, that's you know, not necessarily you know, something that is well understood, you know, in terms of that intent. But up there, I know the Bummer had quite a different experience with Captain Cook and the first settler, or the first Europeans when they came, Shane.
Yeah, mate. You know, everyone knows about Cook and his story, but there are not those that know the Bummer story of what happened with my people and Cook. You know, back in 1770, when Cook came, you know, there was a dispute over some sea turtles that he got, and my people, they actually objected to Cook by collecting those turtles, and the dispute was so tense that you know, Cook fired shots and hit one of our Bummer on the leg, and because of that truth telling now of telling our story of what actually happened was, you know, because of the law of the land in regards to where Cooktown is situated now, you know, the law is that there was no blood to be spilt there, and our people then actually, because of that happened, because of that area, our people came back and we initiated that first act of reconciliation, and by the old fella coming out with the broken tip spear, and that indicated that, you know, we must stop the fighting here, and because it's not the place for it. And that's the sort of story that we need to tell, and making sure that truth telling from our side is actually going to be told. You know, obviously, you know, the 150 words actually also been recorded in Cooktown of our Cook Limited words, and you know, one of those words now is kangaroo, which is, you know, spoken widely, nationally, internationally. Everyone now can speak a word of Cook Limited, and you know, that sort of story that we need to actually tell, and making sure that the truth telling is there, basically. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Shane. I mean, I know with having been to Cooktown in recent times, of just how the local people have actually begun. We're really looking forward to the festivals that were planned for this year, and I know that
Yeah.
they've been deferred along with many things because of the COVID, sort of pandemic or the virus and the sort of social isolation that we've had. But I believe that's going to go ahead in the near future as well, isn't it?
It's still going to go ahead now. Everything has been postponed, as everyone is aware. And, we were using the 250th anniversary of Cook as a platform for us to tell our story, and basically using Cook for us to tell our story. And but everything is now put on hold, and until we can get another date. But it's still going to go ahead, and we like to actually making sure that we tell our story across the world. Yeah.
Look, I think that's a good point. Is how do we tell our story at times, and why we tell our story, and why we need to tell our stories, and as part of truth telling, the need for that to be heard. Cook certainly wrote about that experience. I remember, Shane, in reading
Yep.
some of those journals. And importantly, I know the local Bummer there have kept this oral tradition of this story going. And to the point now where they're actually the rocks where this event took place are now called Reconciliation Rocks up there. And it's the first known, event of reconciliation.
Where it actually, sort of basically in that area where that act occurred. And, we're making sure that, as a historical site where that actual place. So, yeah.
Well, and so that's something that, certainly people can find out more about. But look, in terms of the stories and the history and the connection to country and those sorts of things, another truth that we do have, and I'd like to get our panellists just to maybe pass some comment on this, is the issue of native title. And the fact that as one of the truths historically, native title is about First Nations people's rights to access to land, or back to being on country and being able to practice their custom and law on country. And essentially the Native Title Act, though, basically was also about the non-Indigenous people's rights to land. And so, I mean, from a First Nations point of view, it might be controversial to say this, but, as First Nations people, we tend to view native title as being land rights for non-Indigenous people, not necessarily about giving us the right to be on country. And so that for us is one of the many things as we move forward we've really got to come to terms with. And it really goes back to that, and something that would be good for us to wrap up on today is to talk about, those worldviews, our role as First Nations people being custodians of the land and having that innate responsibility that we must continue to look after it. And for those who have come to this land who have a different view of that, how do we actually balance that? And that's obviously the issue around treaty and the future process. So part of the historical acceptance that we need to go through as a process is here in Queensland beginning to unfold now in the treaty process. And I'm wondering, Cheryl, if you could give us some comment on just how that might look as we move forward.
Well, just quickly, I mean, I want to get back to this thing about telling stories. David mentioned, people need to listen and hear stories. There's a palatable way of hearing stories. So people like to hear the good stories. At the same time, I think the real challenge for reconciliation is about being able to hear the stories that aren't good. You need to be able to be open and to be able to be involved in action that contributes to a change in society, where you can hear about the massacres, you can hear about the rape that occurred, you can hear about the sexual abuse, you can hear about the slavery that our people went through for many years. Okay, brother Shane, you have some stories. There's very little written stories in Southwest Queensland. So it's all relying on oral history. And then when it came to native title, trying to convince, native title lawyers of our, continuing connection to country was very, very difficult and extremely difficult. So we're just one of the many groups who faced that kind of challenge. Some interesting things came out of native title in that I think that people had to go back, remember things that their grannies, grandfathers had told them. And so there was almost a cultural revival in some ways, and a sharing of stories amongst family members who didn't occur before. Native title is not land rights. It's not inalienable freehold title. And the real issue about rights in this country when it comes to land and moving forward is about access. How many people in Queensland, how many Aboriginal people, how many Burma have got real access to country, to their traditional homelands, to the homelands that they were born into and part of for thousands and thousands of years? Very, very few people. And so it's still the white is right in that it is the station owners, if they don't let you in, if the farmers don't let you in, and people have story after story where things were destroyed, cultural sites have been destroyed, remains have been destroyed, everything has been destroyed. And so we're kind of almost getting to a point where I think we're almost at ground zero culturally with so many things. And the issue about treaty and the importance about the treaty discussion was really just to say to people, do you think it's possible? Is this conversation possible within the future? Can we actually sit down nation by nation, as Warmu First Nation, whoever it may be, sitting down with the government to see what is possible within the future? And it always came back to the same thing as Charmaine said, unless they're willing to hear those stories, and those stories about the burning of the huts in Old Mapoon were as alive, at the end of December when we went there, November, as they were when it actually happened. You could feel that intensity and that emotion. And people always say to me, why are you so angry? Why are you blackfellas always so angry? Well, because we are the holders, we are the keepers. We have the knowledge of all of these. They're not stories. They are part of our families' lives. They're a part of our inheritance. And it's a part of the inheritance that we have that is so very difficult. That's why closing the gap will never, ever succeed until people can open up and actually have the truth telling in a real sense. But the other thing that everyone said to us was very, very clear. There is no point in having truth telling unless it becomes part compulsorily of the curricula so that everyone is learning about it from preschool, prep, right through to university. That access is given so that those stories are recorded, they're kept, and they're being used by people to try to heal. You can't have healing if all you're going to do is listen to a little story here and a little story there, and I feel good about everything. That's not what change is about. As blackfellas, we have had to come to terms and understand European ways. We've had to, we couldn't speak language. We couldn't practice culture. We couldn't do anything. We had to stop all of that. And now that people are starting to see the importance of that, then we have to keep drawing on that. And that's where the reconciliation, I believe, is trying to be. But always remember, do not be fooled by the fact that we are still not on a level playing field. And if you don't acknowledge that within your work, within the reconciliation work that you are doing, we will not see the big changes that we need to occur in this country. The treaty process is an opportunity, and I really hope, that once COVID business finishes, that we can get back on track and begin those discussions. COVID happened. It's a spiritual thing. Didn't want Captain Cook celebrations to happen. Why do you think we had COVID in this country? Hell spirits, they always look after us. I can guarantee that.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. And I think But what you've said is really important, and that is that the treaty discussions, we've come to that point in our history as a nation where it's time, and it's time to have these conversations. And reconciliation has been going since 1990, when the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Island Deaths in Custody recommended this as a national priority, one of urgency for Australia to enter into. And here we are 30 years down the track, we're still on this journey. So I think it's incumbent upon our current generations to really take this on as a serious responsibility in terms of our citizenship, as everyone in Australia. I've sort of come to a point, I suppose, where we probably need to start wrapping up our discussion today. And we've covered a little bit of territory. Certainly not only in terms of Queensland, from the southwest to the southeast to the Torres Straits, but importantly, a bit of territory insofar as what we need to be dealing with around historical acceptance. And this journey, I suppose, that we're on at the moment, we are at a point now where truth and the many truths need to be heard. And I'd encourage those of you who are listening in with us today to consider just how those truths might be applying in your own communities there. And so what we might do as we wrap up this conversation is that I might ask the panel members to just maybe give us a couple of points that we might need to consider in our communities, particularly in our Aboriginal communities and non-Indigenous communities and our Torres Strait Islander communities. Just a couple of pointers about tackling truth. Now, I know Cheryl and Bill have both mentioned the issue of healing and the importance of healing. And as we leave today's webinar, we're going to play you a short video from the Healing Foundation of a story of one of Queensland's eminent leaders, I suppose, and a lady who's had an incredible amount of experience, Florence Ono from Townsville. But before we do that, I might just ask the panelists if our people who are listening in today around Queensland and the various communities right throughout the whole of Queensland and our remote, rural and our urban centres, some of the things that they might need to consider in truth-telling. And I know, for example, we need to be safe in these processes. I think we need to be, considerate, but we also need to be prepared to accept that there are many truths as we move forward. So what I might do is I might start off by just asking Charmaine, who's been around this issue for the last 30 years or so, and been on this journey where truth-telling has been very difficult to engage parties. Just maybe one clear indication from you, Charmaine. What can people do to actually begin this truth-telling conversation in their communities?
For a start, I think people need to look at the history of their own communities and not just the white history. Rewrite your own history in your own community. And the other thing I think is people need to understand the concept of sovereignty, that the land was never ceded, so that Aboriginal people have the rights of sovereign people. If white Australia can grasp that, then I think the rest of it will become a lot easier.
Well, thanks, Charmaine. Very wise words there. Shane, in terms of being in that situation where you have a responsibility also to make sure the rest of the nation knows about reconciliation and the first act that happened there, what are some of the things that you might actually, I suppose, think that people should know about when going through this? Because you actually had to go through a whole process there, I know, within your own bummer about that whole issue before you could actually begin to tell that story.
We have to, for those people who are talking about, the truth telling and stuff, if you think it's true, you support that person, you listen to the person, and action that, too many times we always talk, where we need to have say, well, we need to stop talking now, and we need to have action. So that's my point, is have that action and support those people who are speaking the truth and listen to those people.
Yep. So it's important to support everyone in this process as well. David, I know in terms of the Uluru process, but you are working at Queensland Resources Council now too. You're working in a very large community of corporates. You know, what are some of the challenges, I suppose, that they might need to consider when dealing with truth telling there?
Well, that's a very big question, Uncle Bill. It's been a very challenging week, and I'm certainly not going to try to step in and speak about any of the issues that have been happening at the moment, because they're still unfolding, but they're deeply, I suppose, distressing.
And I should just clarify there, we are referring to Rio Tinto in that context, aren't we, in Western Australia, and the issue that's happening nationally at the moment. But we don't want to talk about that at the moment. I'd like to focus on Queensland and our Queensland industries here, and maybe the things they need to consider, or at least one or two things that would guide them on being able to engage in this truth-telling process.
Putting me on the spot without having the opportunity to think about it in advance, I mean, resource sector companies have been very, very willing to engage with dialogue in the past. And in terms of the participation of Indigenous people in those sectors, there's certainly a tremendous capacity, I think, to have those key things translate into actual actions on the ground. Things like making sure that when Indigenous people are at work, that they feel safe at work. Because, you know, it's one thing for corporates to say things like, oh, we want Indigenous people to come and work for us. Well, that's all well and good, but if it's not a space that acknowledges their indigeneity in some important ways, they're going to leave. So doing things like making sure that there's a unilateral understanding of what it means and what the difficulties are being Indigenous. And, you know, I didn't want to give the impression before that I thought that it was all, you know, all good stories. An important thing is to teach organisations and people to hear the bad stories and to sit with that discomfort, because it's not bad to feel uncomfortable. People should feel uncomfortable when they hear those stories. That's not a bad thing. We have to talk about it. So I think there is capacity, a tremendous capacity, both at an organisational level and at a personal level within companies to embrace truth telling and to move forward together.
And in saying that, I do know that many of those companies that have RAPs, for example, are doing precisely that right now. And maybe that's a way forward, is ensuring that more and more people actually are getting involved here. We need to be looking more at reconciliation action plans, and as a basis for not only for organisations but for non-Indigenous people to have a much more open and conversation about some of these truths in their communities. So I think particularly the communities where you serve or where your business is operating, it's important you understand that there are many truths at play in those communities. So thanks, Dave. Cheryl, in terms of many of our First Nations mobs around the country, I know also that in one of your roles you're a chair of the Native Title Prescribed Body Corporates organisation, and as far as many of the truths go, that that is still an ongoing process for many organisations in terms of the First Nations people. But you did hint when you were talking earlier at, I suppose, the process that's happening between First Nations or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people now and landholders. There are a number of truths there around cultural heritage matters. Did you want to elaborate a little bit more on how, you know, non-Indigenous people can actually move forward on cultural heritage matters, at least with our people, in protecting and understanding the importance of them?
Oh, Bill, there's so many things that I want to say. You know, firstly, this state, we're talking about this state. Historically, we've never had a good relationship in this state with Aboriginal people and with local state governments at all. With churches, with trade, you know, with anybody really. And so that's where we always start. Every time we open our eyes as Aboriginal people, as blackfellas, That's where we start. That's our starting point. And I think that there's got to be a recognition that racism is really institutionalized within this state, absolutely institutionalized. If it was just up to me as a human being and talking to other people, but it's not that. We are surrounded by a whole lot of laws, of policies, of governing structures that we have to abide by in our daily lives, that it's like a minefield each day when people get up. So that before you even get to worrying about your place culturally within your nation, you have to go, how am I going to get through this every day? And it's extremely difficult. And I don't think that it's being made less difficult at the moment by local or state governments. And that's the biggest challenge. The corporates are on a mind of their own. And the one thing I wanted to say was, in terms of RAPs, that you have to be very wary that it's not just like government exercise where it's a tick and flick exercises. And I've seen many organisations who go, oh yes, we've got a RAP. And when you start digging down and digging deep into it, you go, you've done no work whatsoever. And so, you know, that's another big challenge there as well. Cultural heritage is not something that sits alone. We are society. We need to be acknowledged as a peoples with a society, and we want to be able to be self-determining. As Charmaine said, the question of sovereignty is a key one for all of us. And until we even get to that place, then everything is an uphill battle. And I think that's really where we are at the moment. I don't want to think that we're anywhere else, because we're not. We're still in this uphill battle. And I think, you know, at times when we were doing the treaty stuff, it was like we just got to the top of the mountain. We just started to see over it, you know, and I think that's where people want to be. They want to be able to not just see over it, but actually walk over that mountain. And I think, you know, the next 20 years, that's where we're all hoping to be. But it's going to take a huge effort. It's going to take a huge effort and a lot of sacrifice from people at all different levels of this society, whether you're black fella, white fella, whatever you are. Because where I'm sitting, brother, we're still at the bottom. We're still at the bottom of the pecking order in this country. There's might be 500 different nationalities who now coexist and live with us in this country. But guess what? When it comes to Murray's still the bottom end of the scale. So long way to go, brother.
Thanks for that. And obviously there's a lot of truths in there that we need to consider as we move forward. Bill, in the Torres Strait, though, a unique sort of people in the world and at the moment spread all over Australia. Bill, in terms of truths, is there one thing that you could say to your mob that they need to consider now as we move forward in truth telling?
Absolutely, Uncle Bill. First of all, I think that we need to introduce into the curriculum at school that the understanding of the Torres Strait region. We had a lot of seafarers came through that territory many years ago prior to Captain Cook. We need to make that acknowledgement. The other thing is that we need to accept Kupai Omarske, means traditional adoption. They do have the right to the same land as the original family members. This is where Uncle Koiki fought for, and he won that. And now it is a federal act that he won that as standing up for what he thinks is his. And it's now the native title. And I also would like to have a better understanding or collaboration between the Torres Strait Islander and the Torres Strait Islander mainland. We need to unite together and be a strong, strong unity and be proud.
And on that note, Uncle Bill, it's great to know that it's a good segue into tomorrow's webinar about unity and the need for that unity. Look, thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions from as a panelist today. I'm certain this is not the beginning. This is just the beginning. It's not the end of the conversation. And I think if we take on board just some of those things that you've mentioned today, everything from treaty to education to the need for more people to become informed about this, truth-telling and the acceptance of truth, the historical acceptance of what has happened in this country that leads us to this point that we need to reconcile as a nation, will become clearer for everyone. And hopefully will actually provide us then the way forward for a unified vision as to what reconciliation, living beyond reconciliation might be like. Mm-hmm. So I'll look forward to that conversation tomorrow. But look, thank you very much for that. And ladies and gentlemen, we've gone well and truly over time today, but look, we mightn't have the video from the Healing Foundation, but you'll be able to find that available on our website, and we invite you to watch that as well. But now I'll hand over to Auntie Jackie Huggins, and thank everyone in our panel, and thank you for joining in today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening today. I hope you've enjoyed the topic, and thank you for your support. And hopefully you would have learnt many things out of this, many lessons to take home, to work within your families, your communities, your businesses, your organisations. It's all very important that we spread the word of reconciliation. So until next time, be safe on our journey together in reconciliation. Because as this theme for this week implies, we are in fact in this together. Thank you.